Welcome to the second installment of our Art Through the Ages Art History Lecture Series. The theme for this unit will be Australian Aboriginal art. Australian Aborigines are the native people to Australia, the people that lived there long before European colonization. The term Aborigine simply means native. Also the term Indigenous simply means native. It is important to understand that this term describes a broad group of people. So just like the term Native American in the United States describes a wide range of Native Americans, such as Cherokee Indians or Sioux Indians or Iroquois Indians, Aborigine refers to anywhere between 200 and 300 different, clans, family clans, tribes, in Australia. So it's a broad term that describes a large, diverse group of people, and it's a term that European people applied to Australian people that they didn't necessarily use to describe themselves. But this is just a number of images of different people of Aboriginal descent. This slide here shows the wide variety of different body paints that different Aboriginal tribes and family clans used when Europeans arrived and first met the Aboriginal people. There weren't really necessarily a lot of different articles of clothing. It's a warm climate. It was not a necessity, but a lot of different Aboriginal people used different types of body paint for ceremonies to designate which tribes they were members of, what roles they played, and some of them were, for particular rituals and things like that. But the Aboriginal people had developed very, bright body paints, rich blacks, whites, bright reds, bright yellows, and really they could mix anything in between yellow and red, orange and things like that, because they had come up with pretty sophisticated dyes and pigments. All right, so this slide, the yellow region of the map shows where Aboriginal people live today in modern day Australia. So it's the kind of central western part of Australia and also the northern coast of Australia. Originally, Aboriginal people would have lived in any habitable part of Australia, but of course when the British arrived around 1788, they kind of pushed the Aboriginal people to different regions of the continent, and this is where they primarily reside today. This area in the center is what we would refer to as the bush. It is primarily desert region, and then the northern region is more coastal, more of a coastal habitat. Okay, so how do we know the Aboriginal people have been in Australia for so long? It's the carbon radio dating of stone artifacts that have been found. They've dated some as far back as 65,000 years ago in Australia, which is pretty exciting. That's really pretty old. These, they, just like the prehistoric people that we've studied in Europe, they had successfully made knives. They made spear tips, they made arrowheads, and they made, early hammers, rocks that were kind of sandwiched between pieces of wood and tied together with, various fibers and things like that. Some of the stone artifacts were a little bit exciting in Australia because they weren't all entirely stone. Some of them were made of precious gems, and you can see some beautiful examples here. So how did people that were of African descent get all the way to Australia? It's generally believed that that these were the first people to really migrate from Africa and begin a continuous culture for a very long time. So the answer to that is that they probably walked over the course of 10 to 15,000 years from Central and Western Africa to Saudi Arabia, and then along the southern edge of Asia, Southeast Asia, and then probably made some kind of boats, and at least at some point in history, Aboriginal people would have had to have been fairly sophisticated boat builders, and have some, comprehension of how to create sails, to do, basically some pretty serious ocean sailing. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that 40,000 years ago it was an ice age, and whenever there's an ice age, a good portion of the water on the planet is frozen and locked up in glaciers at the North and South Pole, and so the ocean level's lower, and so every island, every continent is a little bit bigger, and so a lot of these islands in the Southeast Pacific that are very broken up now were actually joined together in, larger, more solid land masses. And so the island hopping from one island to the next was probably, at least for a while, not as difficult to do. And then when the next Holocene, which was the natural warming period that occurred on the Earth, started, the ocean levels rose again, and again these islands kind of got separated from each other. But we do, even though we don't have any hard evidence of early Aboriginal boats, we see some evidence of it, images of boats in their artwork, and we know that that's really the only way they could have gotten them way there. So this image shows how the sea levels were different. Again, they were lower because of the Ice Age, and this island directly north of Australia is Papua New Guinea, and right now they're a pretty good distance apart from each other, but back then they were one solid landmass with just a little lake right there. And you can see by the green images how they're bigger than the white lines kind of indicate the current islands, and the green lines show the shape of the former islands. So again, larger land masses, smaller bodies of water, and the island hopping would have been easier. And so this image is a little bit fuzzy, but again, this is the route that scientists believe that the Aboriginal people made, when they migrated out of Africa. So again, central to Western Africa, into present-day Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. We do know for sure that they traveled on these western islands of, the Pacific Islands, because there is actually some genetic evidence and things like that. And we think that they left anywhere from 62,000 to 75,000 years before present. So that's a really long time ago. And again, the longest continuous culture to exist outside of Africa. We believe people lived in Africa anywhere from 200 to 300,000 years, but we can't really call it a continuous culture because different cultures or kingdoms and governments rose and fell and replaced each other and things like that. So actually migrating off the continent of Africa and kind of being sort of stranded far away from other cultures allowed this, the Aboriginal people to survive and thrive for many years until the British arrived. So Indigenous Australians also share some genetic ancestry with ancient Asians, Southeastern Asia and Pacific Islanders. That's not modern Asian and Pacific Islanders, but just like when we talked about the prehistoric people of Europe, how there are Neanderthals throughout Europe, there were other human-like species, hominid species in Asia. There was another one that was similar to Neanderthals in Asia that we found had genetic heritage with the Aboriginal people. So all of these images I have here, of course, are of modern Southeast Asian and Pacific Island people, people from Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and things like that. I did specifically actually choose, primarily images of women. So one thing I wanted to kind of sort of emphasize here was that, again, when the ocean levels rose, between these islands and things like that, it kind of separated these cultures and allowed for a lot of really diverse cultures to evolve in a very kind of small area. And so lots of times showcasing women's costumes really exaggerates the cultural differences between different cultures and things like that. So again, why I chose those pictures. Now, it's important to understand that Australian Aboriginal people, although they thrived for 60 to 70,000 years, unfortunately, in the last 200 to 300 years, I would say 200 to 250 years, they've suffered, pretty severe injustices. And it often, the treatment they received mimics a lot of what happened to Native Americans and African Americans in the United States. So many of you know that when Christopher Columbus first arrived to South America, the Spanish brought with them many diseases that Native Americans in South America had never been exposed to. measles, mumps, rubella, tuberculosis, a lot of the things that we get shots for before we go into kindergarten. Europeans had developed some immunities to these diseases and Native people had not. So unfortunately, they estimate that almost maybe 90% of South Americans passed away, Native Americans passed away, simply by being introduced to European diseases. The same exact thing happened in Australia. Aboriginal people were heavily, damaged just simply by these epidemics. But then second, they were also treated with severe racial discrimination and social injustices. Specifically what happened to the Aboriginal people is the Europeans, when they arrived, and it was primarily British, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, but primarily, I believe, British and Irish. When they arrived, they mistakenly perceived somehow that they were more sophisticated or, morally more ethical or something than Aboriginal people, which simply was not true. But they stole the Aboriginal people's children and they sort of adopted them unwillingly. So, of course, this is heartbreaking for Aboriginal families. They were not adopted to be children that were loved by their families, but to be raised as domestic servants. So although it was not called slavery, although it was not a legalized institution like slavery in the United States, it was essentially the same thing. Vulnerable people being stolen from their families, forced into labor that they did not choose, into a life that they did not choose, and being disconnected from their family. Often at a young age when they had absolutely no power against the people that were doing this to them. Eventually this translated into, societal problems for the entire culture. So this reduced education for Aboriginal people, which lowered graduation rates, and of course increased unemployment rates. This also led to higher alcohol and drug abuse. Cigarette smoking is pretty big amongst the Aboriginal culture. Also, it led to higher incarceration rates, imprisonment, crime, things like that. And so these are all things that happen to a culture when you break apart families take away their support system completely. Then in the 1960s, Aboriginal people did also have civil rights marches. And this is another thing that's important to understand, that, we understand that Martin Luther King is an American hero. John Lewis is an American hero for helping write the Voting Rights Act. But really what they did was much bigger than just helping people in the United States. The Aboriginal people got the right to vote in the 1960s in Australia, and part of the reason is because Martin Luther King's speeches were heard everywhere. His videotapes were played around the world, and they resonated with people around the world, and it affected change for people around the world. And same thing, John Lewis's Voting Rights Act really secured voting for African Americans in the 1960s. It did the same thing for Aboriginal people in Australia. So this video, I'm going to insert another YouTube video here, really explains the sort of oppression that occurred to Aboriginal people very well.
Australia's Aboriginal people have faced extreme historical persecution, so much so that in 1998, Australia implemented an annual National Sorry Day. This holiday serves as a form of recompense, and it raises awareness of Indigenous populations. So who are Australia's Aboriginal people? Well, Australia is home to many different Indigenous populations. They include the Wiradjuri in New South Wales and the Noongar in Western Australia. Aboriginal populations are often grouped together and referred to as Aborigines. However, some consider that term pejorative. Instead, legally, the native populations of Australia are referred to as Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders. Some also prefer regional terms like Ku-eri in New South Wales or Murri in Queensland. Recently, a genetic study found that native Australian peoples may have left Africa up to 75,000 years ago, likely representing one of the oldest continuous populations outside Africa. For centuries, they thrived in Australia, usually in nomadic societies. Some developed distinct tools like the boomerang used for hunting and the didgeridoo, a musical instrument which is still popular today. Their extensive legends and oral traditions are sometimes referred to as dreaming and help explain their way of life and the world around them. By the time Europeans first established a colony in Australia in 1788, native populations were thought to number around 300,000, and there have been an estimated 300 different Aboriginal languages spoken. However, with the subsequent colonization of Australia, new diseases, violence spurred by racism, and oppressive land use policies devastated many of the traditional societies. Currently, Aboriginal people account for just 3% of the Australian population. Only about 75 Aboriginal languages still remain, and many are in danger of dying out completely. Up until several decades ago, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders faced extreme racism and government encroachment on their territories. Many were not given Australian citizenship nor federal suffrage until the mid-20th century. Also, during that time, the Australian government supported forcibly taking Aboriginal children away from their parents. The reason for such policies varied, but many claimed it was for child protection and re-socialization. The children taken away from their homes were eventually known as the stolen generation, and they were raised to be domestic servants and laborers. The government has since formally apologized for their part in creating the stolen generation, and National Sorry Day is specifically in honor of them. Although in modern times there has been a huge change in the government's attitudes towards Aboriginal people, high rates of unemployment, poverty, crime, and health problems for the populations persist. Aboriginal representation in the Australian government also remains low, and even today, land disputes between Indigenous groups and the government are ongoing. For a different perspective,
Apologize. Sometimes when I do the YouTube videos, I have to kind of exit out of the PowerPoint and come back in. So when the British colonized Australia in 1788, there were estimated to be anywhere from 250 to even maybe 300 different Aboriginal settlements, family clans, tribes, things like that. And at least 250 languages have been documented. And unfortunately, most of those have since been lost. There's only 75 active languages today, and there's not many people that are truly fluent in them. A lot of Aboriginal people speak English now, and it's harder to keep those traditions alive. My graphic on the right shows the word hello in a number of Aboriginal languages, and the graphic on the left shows the names of the numerous languages that have been documented that at least used to exist in Australia. So up until this point, I've been kind of emphasizing the diversity of the many Aboriginal tribes that we discussed, but there are some common spiritual beliefs among Australian Aboriginal people. And I sort of liken this to the fact that Christianity is widespread in Europe and North America, South America, and other parts of the world. And even though these people speak completely different languages, celebrate different holidays, wear different clothing, the religion itself, the basic tenets remain the same. The same with Islam. Islam is widespread in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and even really Eastern Asia, as well as North Africa, also in the United States and Europe. And again, the people wear completely different clothing, go to different temples, speak different languages, celebrate even different holidays, but the basic tenets of the religion remain pretty similar throughout cultures. So this is the same with Australian Aborigines, even though there were maybe even 300 different languages, different tribes. Each one of them kind of perceives has their creation story called the dreaming or called the dream time. And this is pretty consistent throughout the continent. So, many Aboriginal tribes think of their creation story, like I said, as dream time, or they call it the dreaming. They think of it as their ancestral spirits kind of going through the land and naming the different objects and living creatures that were there. The dream time does not necessarily just represent the past, but also the present and the future. And again, these are some of the symbols that we see kind of consistently among various Aboriginal tribes. So they say the ancestors named things. These are some of the symbols they used to kind of name those things. First of all, the horseshoe shape, the upside down horseshoe, means a person. If it has one line beside it, it's a woman. If it has a second line beside it, it's a man. That we see lots of animal prints. The emu footprint, which it's like kind of a three kind of toed bird, and kangaroo tracks, kind of little simultaneous side-by-side footprints, other animal tracks. The little circles can represent eggs or seeds. The spiral can be a campsite or a home. A spiral with other kind of details coming out of it is meaning place. And if you have two spirals and kind of wavy lines connecting them, that can mean running water. Now, some of the religious beliefs, people in the West would kind of describe these as animist. That does not mean they believe in animals as their gods, but rather that all things are animated. They sort of believe that everything has a life force. They believe, humans have a life force, animals have a life force, plants have a life force, but also objects. They believe, rocks and artwork that people make. They believe the artist sort of endows it with a certain life force. So that's, kind of part of their respect for nature and art comes from these beliefs. Also, they are very good spear hunters. And by the way, in the image, some of the animals I have are the kangaroo, the koala, the kookaburra. These are all animals that Aboriginal people would have kind of grown up with. I could have also included dingoes, which are a type of dog. But as I was saying, the Aboriginal people are, especially the coastal people up north, are sophisticated spear hunters. They're able to, kill fish, stingray, turtles with a single spear. And they're one of the few groups on Earth that are legally allowed to continue hunting endangered species because their hunting practices are so much more environmentally stable. So, sometimes in the West we are putting giant nets into the ocean that are pulling in hundreds and thousands of fish in one swoop. They're simply, using one spear to stab one animal and eat, or get a number of animals and feed their family. And it's a much more sustainable, kind of environmentally ethical practice. And so they are one of the few people that still have the right to do that. So they do believe in ancestral spirits. Some are human-like, some are animal-like. I'm probably going to mispronounce these. Biamiye, the Sky Father, Dirawong the Protector, the Rainbow Serpent, and the Bunjil Bird. We do see some earthworks. We see cave paintings and rock paintings. There's not necessarily as many caves in Australia as we saw in Europe, but because of the dry desert climate, some things that they've done just on rocks that are exposed to the elements have stayed in good shape because they're not continually rained upon, or lots of mold is growing on them and damaging them that way. And then there are a couple instances of earthworks like this bird right here. Not lots and lots of earthworks, or at least ancient ones that we know of. And they do include lots of Australian animals, but also the serpent and lizards are images that we see in a lot of their artwork. Unlike the West where we have somewhat demonized snakes and things like that, they have a great reverence for snakes and things like that, and include it happily in a lot of their artwork. So another type of art form that Aboriginals are known for are rock paintings and bark paintings. So we've already seen that they had a very elaborate body paint, but they also did some of the earliest cave paintings that we've discovered. The images on the left are supposed to be women. The images in the middle are kind of like skulls. And the images on the right, we would kind of describe these as their X-ray style. They are, where we see kind of the outside and the inside of the animal together. And they are, the two images on the right are bark paintings. So they have some trees in Australia that when you peel the bark off, it stays together kind of in one nice sheet. And they can sort of use that as paper or canvas to make images. So here are a couple examples of some of the cave paintings. Some of them, such as the handprints, the negative handprints, are over 30,000 years old, so almost as old as those, some of the ones that we saw in Europe that we studied earlier. And you see the negative handprints. They also made negative boomerang prints. So really kind of an interesting addition to this age-old type of mural that we see all around the world. And one thing that I would say that they did that was strikingly different than the European rock paintings and parallel paintings is they certainly introduced lots of pattern. They definitely abstracted images. They weren't necessarily doing them just as you saw them in the world. They definitely included some kind of degree of costume or body paint that you would see on the people. And with the animals, they didn't just draw them like they were in the real world, but they added fun patterns and stripes and cross-hatching and dots and things like that. So this is another kind of degree of sophistication that we see kind of in human development. This other image in the upper left, while it's probably only, it's less than 500 years old for sure, this is pretty interesting. At some point, some Dutch boats and some other European boats came close to some of their settlements, and they saw them for the first time, and simply from memory, some of the Aboriginal people drew these European boats on the walls to kind of communicate to other people what they had seen. And I'm sure this was quite a shock to the people, and really a super fascinating thing to see something, even though it's only several hundred years old, still totally fascinating, and can imagine what it was like for those people to see that for the first time. So these are some more examples of bark paintings. So like I said, they're on the interior of bark strips from various trees. Originally, Aboriginal people did this for educational purposes and ceremonial purposes, but now they're really considered to be valuable art pieces. And Aboriginal art is a multi-million-dollar industry in Australia now. Frankly, Europeans have profited significantly from the Aboriginal art, but it's becoming, they're trying harder and harder to ensure that this money comes back to the Aboriginal population rather than, people profiteering off of other people's work. So again, we see lots of these kind of X-ray style animals and people. There's a dot style that we'll talk about. And again, boats. So like I said, we don't have any hardcore evidence of Aboriginal people being a boating culture, but certainly they had to have been at some point to get all the way from Africa to Australia. So this slide shows the two major regional styles of painting that we see in Australia. The images on the left are the dot style. Dot style is just like it sounds, a lot of dots, but they also include other lines, shapes, symbols and things like that, bright colors and things like that. The images on the right are examples of the X-ray style. And we've seen this already through this PowerPoint quite a bit. Sometimes you'll see both together. Frequently, the dot style is included with the X-ray style. In modern times, X-rays simply kind of show the bones inside a person's body. Their X-ray style might show the bones, but it also sometimes illustrates organs, major organs. In this case, jellyfish don't really have a skeletal inside, but they still kind of illustrate maybe the nervous system or the thicker tissues and things like that in the jellyfish. All right, so these are images of the X-ray style. Again, it shows kind of an exterior silhouette, the contour lines of the outside shape of an animal, but also the interior skeletal details. So lots of times we see the backbone, maybe the rib cage, the major bones of the body, not every detail, and again, maybe some important organs, frequently the lungs or the stomach. But they definitely were not aiming to get these scientifically accurate. They were, they were referencing some of the important features of the animal. So again, when they thought of animals, they didn't just think of the outside being important, but certainly the inside was just important. So I think this reflects an understanding of anatomy, and how organs were important to a creature's life and things like that, and maybe how a hunter could use that knowledge to make a quicker kill as well. But again, you can see that they definitely embraced abstraction, embraced patterns, and definitely made art for art's sake, in the sense that they made things beautiful and didn't make them just realistic and kind of recreate what things look like in the real world, but had fun in adorning the images they made. All right, so in Western standards, we would kind of describe these as non-objective paintings, meaning they don't necessarily have objects in the images. They sort of simply look like playing with fun shape and color, and a lot of modern artwork looks like that in the West. But that is not how Aboriginal people perceive these at all. Lots of the dot paintings are actually meant to illustrate sacred dreams that they've had. Some are individual dreams by an individual person. Other are dreams that have been passed down down through storytelling from generation to generation. Anyway, lots of the shapes that we see, again, the horseshoe, remember, that represents a person. A spiral could be a campsite or a home. Little dots could be seeds or eggs. So someone that was fluent in some of the symbols in Aboriginal culture could interpret these paintings in a way that we maybe would not be able to do, with our eyes. So beautiful, but also actually truly telling stories. So the colors, the bright colors that we saw it in the body paint, we see it in the artwork. They come from a couple different plants. The yellow comes from an onion root, and it looks like, these roots look almost as big as tree roots, but they produce a very yellow pigment that they used in body paint and in their artwork. And then at the bottom here, we have an image of bloodroot, which is also nicknamed kangaroo paw. But this also, at the very bottom, produces a bright red and a little bit higher in orange. And you can see this woman here has simply just dyed some plant fibers with the bloodroot, and you can see just how brilliant and bright the colors are. And again, this was kind of an advancement, as far as we can tell, for very ancient cultures to get, a larger variety of colors. And because they could also make white and black very bright and clean, they basically could do any color in the warm, series, like, yellow, peach, orange, red, pink, maroon, burgundy, browns, anything like that. Okay, so the dot and x-ray style are not just used for body paint and artwork, but also to decorate boomerangs and didgeridoo musical instruments that they have. The boomerang is actually a weapon. We're accustomed to seeing the traditional shape, which is kind of like a sort of wide V shape. But you can see in the image on the left that boomerangs come in a large variety of shapes. Some of them are more arc shaped, some of them have one shorter end, a longer end, and there are technically some that have 3 and 4 prongs as well. So there's a large variety of those. And sometimes we see just a wood grain, but lots of times they're decorated with traditional Aboriginal artwork. All right, so this is just a throwing demonstration. Another video that this guy is just fabulous at throwing boomerangs, and I thought it'd be kind of interesting to watch.
And ready to throw. Come closer to the net. I'll demonstrate. What you do, throw the boomerang out in this direction, picture a big clock facing you, hold it 12 o'clock. Reach back, step forward, bring it over your shoulder and release, 1 o'clock. Tilt it to the right. Try not to drop this angle and throw it like this, can be very dangerous. What will happen? Boomerang go up, come back down. What you want is a nice circle, like so. If it does return and you want to catch it, brother, you'll demonstrate.
See, that was airborne for a really long time.
Clapping motion, fingers out of the way. Left hand, opposite direction, you're releasing 11 o'clock. I throw up my right hand up. Folks, the boomerangs are a bit wet and damp, so give it a bit of power. Do we have any left-handers in this group? Wow. None?
Wow.
Yes! One at a time, please.
I'll try left-handed.
What you do is a flock of birds would fly this direction. You throw the boomerangs in the same direction as the birds. What will happen? They curve in towards them, knocking them out of the sky. Like so.
See, here he threw 3 at the same time. You can see how that would be very effective in hunting. So really nice throwing demonstration. Primarily used, there we go. Primarily used to hunt birds, but of course, if you could throw multiple boomerangs, you could probably knock larger animals out, like a kangaroo and things like that, stun them enough to, kill them later. But I believe that they were primarily used for birds. Okay, so the didgeridoo, this is another invention by Aboriginal people. It is a musical instrument. We know for sure they were used in the Northern Territories, but didgeridoos are simply hollowed out logs, often hollowed out by termites. And so it's very possible that these existed in other places, and we've seen examples of them in other parts of the Pacific Islands, and it wouldn't be unusual at all, I don't think, to find out later that this also came from Africa. Just a very simple method for creating an instrument. So This video is just going to let you hear what a didgeridoo sounds like. I'm just going to play a few seconds of it. Okay, and again, I'm probably going to have to close out of that video. Didgeridoos sound a little bit kind of like, maybe bees buzzing a little bit as far as natural sounds go. Now, in that last video, you saw that there was a large rock formation, and that's known as Uluru. And this video kind of just tells a little bit about that because that rock is also sacred to the Aboriginal people.
Kolinira utawa mora mora kar chokorba to read we read it and the mora believe chokorba we believe we anga chokorba.
My name is Lindsay. I'm from Alice Springs and I work at Tourism Northern Territory. Today I'm out here with the Google Trekker, part of Google's effort to map the world so people can experience it through Street View. Uluru, it's a very sacred site for the traditional owners. It tells their creation stories through different features in the rock, which are passed down through story and song and dance, and for us to be able to experience it, it's really generous of them.
Sometimes you go to the high view, on a cooling way, Mora, you go to the place, but the place, you know, two more with that, you go right there.
So we've been walking the Kunya Trail and it's pretty incredible because when you drive into the national park you see this huge, amazing, monumental rock, but when you get up really close you start to notice all the different textures in the rock. It looks a little bit sandpapery in some places, a bit smooth in others, and all the little crevices light up at sunrise and sunset. It's really otherworldly out here. I hope these images inspire people around the world to learn more about Uluru and Katajuda.
Elege mora wanda yana chokor ko wanda ngai chokor velo yana yoko mora holme
Okay, and again I have to kind of close out. But it's really rare to hear people speak some of the native languages, so that's one thing that I liked about it in particular, and we can see that really some of the early parietal rock painting is right on that. You will hear people refer to that as Ayers Rock. That is what, when the British arrived, the man that discovered the rock there was named Ayr, but really, that's kind of an inappropriate thing to refer to it as because Uluru was the word that the Aboriginal people that had lived there for a long time had referred to it, and it was a sacred name to them, and so we should refer to it as Uluru as well, and that is becoming more normal to refer to it. Uluru Kata is the full name. So this is simply just an image of a didgeridoo being used in a tribal ceremony, but again shows kind of the beauty of, there it is, beauty of one of their ceremonies. Now, the root of the word didgeridoo, it does not have the happiest beginnings. Didgeridoo, even though it might sound as though it's an Aboriginal term, it is not. It is actually an Irish Gaelic word. So Again, the Irish and British were primarily the people coming to Australia. They came to Australia for a completely different reason, weren't necessarily trying to escape religious persecution, but used the island as kind of a prison to sort of dump people that they didn't want to deal with again. And when the British arrived and first saw the instrument, the Irish kind of came up with a nickname for it, and it was a combination of a number of nicknames. One that meant black or native, another one that meant like trumpeter, crooner, or hummer, and another word that meant puffer and chain smoker. And it kind of makes sense why the Irish might put these words together to come up with a nickname for the instrument. But this is not the term. Didgeridoo is not the term that Aboriginal people use to describe the instrument. Now, unfortunately, Aboriginal people are only 3% of the population now, and 97% of the people in Australia are of European or Asian descent. And for that reason, the word didgeridoo is simply stuck, and those 200, 300 languages that had different terms for the didgeridoo are kind of being lost, and they are not consistent, and simply no other term has sort of taken the place. But if you were fluent in the Aboriginal language, they most likely would have a different name for this term. So it's just important to understand that the term didgeridoo itself is a European word placed on an Aboriginal instrument, and that it sort of is, I would say, kind of politically incorrect and insensitive in its description of the instrument. So, didgeridoos are made from eucalyptus tree trunks. Eucalyptus is that tree that we see koala bears hanging out in. They eat the leaves of that. Eucalyptus trees are, all plentiful in Australia. They actually, I believe, they also live in northern Africa. So it'd be interesting if the migrants brought some seeds with them over the years, but we don't know that. Anyway, termites naturally hollow these out, so they don't actually have to do any interior carving. They just let the insects do their thing, and then when they find a branch that's been hollowed out, they can make an instrument out of it. And there's several things that are pretty interesting about this. The way they go and look for a tree that may have been hollowed out is usually they look for a tree that is, showing signs of weakness, dying, or death. And then they go kind of knock on the tree itself, and if it sounds hollow, they know that it's probably going to make a pretty good didgeridoo. So this is another thing that's kind of nice and environmentally ethical about it, is they're not cutting down brand new trees to make the didgeridoos, but are actually looking for trees that are near death or totally dead, and using those to create the instrument. So that's actually kind of clearing the environment for new growth, which I think is pretty interesting. Once a good trunk is found, with the knock test, they do try to cut and make a very long instrument. The longer it is, the deeper and louder the sound can be. So they need to be a minimum of 3 feet long, but sometimes they are as long as maybe even 10 feet. So the bark is peeled off, and then beeswax is applied. So in this upper graphic right here, you can see a person has kind of rolled out beeswax into a cylinder, and then formed it into a loop, and then that loop is applied to the edge of the wood. Of course, if there was no beeswax there, the wood would be kind of rough on your face and could scratch it and be uncomfortable to play. And the great thing is, if that beeswax wears down, you can simply add more. And then lots of times artists will add an additional dot painting or x-ray style to the didgeridoos, but usually some of the wood is left exposed, and occasionally you'll see examples of artists that have carved away detail as well. And it is, like I said, kind of an aesthetic to leave some of the wood grain exposed. Part of this is that the Aboriginal people just are so in touch with nature and appreciate nature that they like to have the wood grain exposed. It's also because musicians do like to kind of look at the wood that didgeridoos have been made out of. They can be made from more than just eucalyptus trees, and sometimes that affects the sound and quality, and so people would like to examine that as well. But it's just an aesthetic, a philosophy of beauty, that to enjoy the wood grain and the details and the veins that are exposed, and and to stain the wood rather than completely paint and cover it. All right, so playing a didgeridoo is not just blowing into a tube. It's sort of uninterrupted humming and vibrations of the lips. So it is very unique to the artist or musician that's playing it. It's just kind of as different as we might sound if we were all singing. The same is true of the didgeridoo. It sounds completely different depending on the musician that is playing it. The sound effects and things that they do to make their sounds come out one of a kind. So musicians, what they try to do when they're playing the didgeridoo is something called circular breathing. And this allows them to make long, extended sounds. So they breathe in through their nose, breathe out through their mouth, and do this continuously. And more experienced people can do this for a long period of time. Of course, if you listen to people that play didgeridoos, sometimes they do create a sort of a rhythm, and there is pauses in the rhythm that allow them to take bigger intakes of air and things like that. So very skilled musicians are known to be able to sustain notes for up to 45 minutes. And this is probably not just an athletic achievement, but really, something that takes a lot of practice and skill, many years to really develop that kind of, what do I want to say? Ability to just do that long. All right, so due to religious beliefs, traditional didgeridoo music was mostly played just for ceremonial purposes and only played by men. This was because it was a sacred ritual. People were specifically chosen in the tribe, perhaps because of their skill or their seniority, and things like that. But it was just traditionally a role only given to men. So, of course, a lot of women in modern day cultures do play the didgeridoo, and it is socially acceptable in modern times. But to Aboriginal people, to have a woman play sometimes could be, somewhat offensive. Because that's not how it would have been used in their sacred ceremonies and things like that. So, something to consider if you're a woman and, visiting and wanting to buy a didgeridoo. I wouldn't discourage anybody from doing it, but just as if, you were from the West and you were traveling somewhere in the Middle East and women were expected to have head coverings, you might wear a head covering out of respect for that culture. Same thing here. You might purchase a didgeridoo but not necessarily play it out of respect for the culture, and then you can take it home and have a good time. Many modern musicians do play didgeridoos for recreation. The gentleman on the left has become notable. He does solos sometimes. It accompanies orchestras and symphonies. So the Sydney Opera House is a famous building. It's kind of famous like the Eiffel Tower is to Paris. A lot of people are aware of it. Anyway, they have lots of performances of orchestras and symphonies, and it will be kind of a traditional woodwind brass orchestra, and lots of times they will have didgeridoo musicians accompany that Western music, or at least one person solo. And then even it's also been included with beatboxing, and rap music in modern times. And so my last video kind of shows an example of there's sort of rap battle style didgeridoo battles. This particular competition is actually being held in France, so you'll hear the spokesperson speaking French. But I'm just going to play a few seconds to kind of give you an idea of what some of this modern beatboxing combined with Aboriginal didgeridoos sounds like. Some people might perceive this as kind of cultural appropriation, or some people might just appreciate that it's a new twist on music and it's kind of a creative invention. And I thought it'd be of interest to you.
Et maintenant, c'est parti. Solo, demi-finale, Zalem, Strawberry Man. 5, 4, 3.
Okay, so that was Zalem, I believe. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.